Harold Thompson opened his eyes at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., just as he had done every day for the past 75 years. The morning sunlight was barely peeking through his bedroom curtains, casting a soft golden glow across the small room. At 93 years old, his body might have aged, but his military discipline remained as strong as ever. His weathered hands reached for the wooden bedside table, where his wire-rimmed glasses sat next to a faded photograph of his late wife, Margaret. She had passed away 3 years ago, but Harold still whispered "Good morning, sweetheart" to her picture every day. Next to the photograph stood his prized possession, a veteran's cap covered with carefully arranged military pins, each telling a story from his time in World War II. The old veteran's movements were slow but purposeful as he made his bed with military precision. The corners were tucked tight enough to bounce a quarter off the surface, just like he'd learned in basic training all those years ago. Harold might live alone now, but he refused to let his standards slip. In the bathroom, he carefully combed his thin white hair and trimmed his neat mustache. His reflection showed a face marked by time, deep wrinkles around his eyes and mouth that spoke of both laughter and hardship. But his blue eyes remained sharp and alert, scanning his appearance with the same attention to detail that had kept him alive during the war. Harold dressed methodically, pressed khaki pants, a clean white shirt, and his favorite navy blue sweater, even though the weather was warming up. Better to be overdressed than underdressed, Margaret used to say, and he still lived by those words. Last came his most important accessories, his veteran's cap and his wooden walking cane, though he didn't really need the cane most days. It just made people feel better to see an old man with one. At 7:15 a.m., Harold stepped out of his small suburban home onto Maple Street. The morning air was crisp, and the sidewalk was quiet except for Mrs. Rodriguez next door, who was already tending to her flower garden. She waved cheerfully, and Harold tipped his cap to her, just as he did every morning. The walk to Joe's Diner took exactly 12 minutes at Harold's steady pace. He enjoyed every step, noting the changes in his neighborhood: new flowers blooming in gardens, children's bicycles left on lawns, and the occasional cat watching him from a windowsill. The routine brought him comfort in a world that seemed to change faster every day. Joe's Diner sat in a strip mall that had seen better days. The parking lot had more cracks than smooth pavement, and the building's paint was starting to peel. But to Harold, it was a second home. The bell above the door chimed as he pushed it open at exactly 7:30 a.m., and the familiar smell of coffee and bacon wrapped around him like a warm blanket. "Morning, Harold," called Sally, the waitress who had been serving him breakfast for the past 15 years. She was already moving towards his usual booth with a cup of coffee. The usual today. Harold smiled and nodded, settling into the red vinyl booth that had molded to his shape over the years. "Thank you, Sally," he said, his voice carrying the gentle strength of a man who had seen both the worst and best of humanity. As he waited for his breakfast, 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat toast, and 3 strips of bacon, Harold watched the morning regulars filter in. There was Tom, the high school teacher, grabbing his coffee before class. Martha and George, the retired couple who always shared a plate of pancakes. Young Jimmy, the newspaper delivery boy, stopping in for a hot chocolate after finishing his route. Harold sipped his coffee and felt at peace. This was his world, predictable and comfortable. The diner's other customers treated him with respect, often stopping by his booth to chat or thank him for his service when they noticed his cap. Some even asked to hear his war stories, though he usually kept those to himself. The memories were still too sharp, too real to share over breakfast. Little did Harold know that this morning would be different. His peaceful routine was about to be disrupted in a way that would force him to draw upon strengths he hadn't needed to use in decades. The peace of Harold's morning shattered when the deep rumble of motorcycle engines filled the air. Through Joe's Diner's wide front window, he watched as 5 motorcycles roared into the parking lot. The bikes were big and black, their chrome parts gleaming in the morning sun. Their riders wore dark leather jackets with a symbol Harold didn't recognize, a red skull wearing a crown. Sally paused beside his table, coffee pot trembling slightly in her hand. "That's the 3rd time this week they've shown up," she whispered. "They're scaring away our regular customers." Harold watched as the bikers parked their motorcycles across 3 spaces each, taking up most of the small parking lot. They were clearly doing it on purpose, leaving little room for other cars to park. Mrs. Chen, who owned the small flower shop next door, hurried inside her store when she saw them arriving. The bell above the diner's door rang aggressively as the bikers strutted in. Their heavy boots thumped against the checkered floor, and their leather jackets creaked as they moved. The leader, a tall man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his neck, looked around the diner like he owned it. Well, what do we have here?" the leader said loudly, his voice drowning out the gentle music playing from the diner's old jukebox. "Looks like the early bird special crowd." His friends laughed, the sound harsh and unfriendly. Joe, the diner's owner, emerged from the kitchen. His round face was red with worry as he approached the group. "Gentlemen, welcome to Joe's. Please, take any seat you'd like." The bikers spread out, choosing the biggest booth, one usually reserved for families. They sprawled across the seats, their leather jackets squeaking against the vinyl. Their leader, who the others called Spike, kept his sunglasses on inside the diner. Harold noticed how other customers began to leave quietly. Tom the teacher grabbed his coffee to go, avoiding eye contact with the bikers. Martha and George hurriedly paid their bill, leaving their pancakes half-eaten. Even young Jimmy slipped out without finishing his hot chocolate. The bikers ordered their breakfast loudly, making inappropriate jokes and comments that made Sally uncomfortable. When she brought their coffee, one of them deliberately stuck out his foot, nearly tripping her. The group laughed as she struggled to keep the coffee pot from spilling. Harold's hands tightened around his coffee cup. In all his years coming to Joe's, he had never seen such disrespect. He watched as Joe tried to maintain a brave face, but the owner's hands shook slightly as he rang up departing customers' bills. Outside, more customers turned away when they saw the motorcycles blocking the parking lot. An elderly woman with a walker couldn't find space to park her small car and sadly drove away. The flower shop remained empty, with Mrs. Chen peeking nervously through her window from time to time. As Harold finished his breakfast, he heard Spike talking loudly to his group. "This place could use some changes," the biker leader announced. "Too many old-timers. Too quiet. Maybe we should make it our regular morning spot. Show them how to have some real fun." The other bikers cheered at this idea, banging their fists on the table and making the silverware rattle. Sally almost dropped a plate of eggs she was carrying to another customer. Harold stood up slowly, reaching for his walking cane. As he made his way to the counter to pay his bill, he had to pass by the bikers' table. One of them stuck out his leg, just like they had done to Sally. "Watch your step, Grandpa," the biker sneered. "Wouldn't want you to break a hip." Harold carefully stepped over the outstretched boot, his military training helping him maintain his balance. He said nothing, but his blue eyes took in every detail of the group, their faces, their tattoos, the patches on their jackets. As he paid his bill, he patted Joe's hand reassuringly. "Everything okay, Joe?" he asked quietly. Joe shook his head slightly. "They've been coming more often, Harold. I don't know what to do. They're driving away my customers, but I'm afraid to call the police. They might do something to the diner." Harold nodded thoughtfully, his mind already working on a plan. As he walked toward the door, he heard one of the bikers mock his veteran's cap, making fun of the military pins. But Harold Thompson hadn't survived World War II by reacting without thinking. He had learned long ago that timing was everything. Walking home that morning, Harold knew his peaceful routine had changed. But what the bikers didn't know was that they had just challenged the wrong veteran. The next morning, Harold woke up earlier than usual. His military instincts, sharpened by years of combat, told him to be prepared. He put on his usual neat outfit, but added something special today, a small Marine Corps pin that he usually kept in his drawer. The pin was special, marking him as a combat instructor, though most people wouldn't know its significance. When he arrived at Joe's diner, the bikers' motorcycles were already there, taking up even more parking spaces than before. Harold noticed they had added orange traffic cones around their bikes, making it almost impossible for other cars to park nearby. As Harold approached the diner's entrance, he had to walk between two of the motorcycles. The space was narrow, and his cane accidentally brushed against one bike's shiny chrome surface. The sound of metal touching metal was soft, but it might as well have been a thunderclap. "Hey!" Spike's voice boomed from behind him. "What do you think you're doing, old-timer?" Harold turned slowly, facing the biker leader who had emerged from the diner. Spike was even taller up close, with muscles bulging under his leather jacket. 4 other bikers followed him, spreading out in a half-circle around Harold. "Just heading in for my breakfast," Harold replied calmly, his voice steady. His blue eyes met Spike's gaze without flinching. "You touched my bike?" Spike growled, stepping closer. Nobody touches my bike. Don't you know who we are? We're the Crown Skulls, and this is our territory now. Harold stood his ground, his grip tightening slightly on his cane. Last I checked, this was a public parking lot in a free country, a country I fought to keep free. One of the younger bikers laughed mockingly. Oh, look at the tough guy, showing off his little war pins. What war was that, Gramps? The Civil War? The group laughed, but Harold noticed something in Spike's eyes, a flicker of uncertainty when he saw the Marine Corps pin. It was quick, but Harold hadn't survived combat by missing small details. You should watch your mouth, boy, Harold said quietly to the young biker, and learn some respect. Spike stepped even closer, trying to use his height to intimidate Harold. Respect. You want respect? Let me tell you something, old man. Times have changed. Your generation's done. This is our world now. Inside the diner, customers watched through the windows. Sally had her phone out, ready to call the police. Joe stood nervously by the door, torn between helping Harold and protecting his business. You're right about one thing, Harold replied, his voice carrying across the parking lot. Times have changed, but some things haven't. Honor, courage, respect for others. Those things don't change. Spike reached out and flicked Harold's veteran's cap, knocking it slightly askew. What are you going to do about it, Grandpa? Call your Walker Brigade. Harold adjusted his cap slowly, deliberately. His movements were calm, but his eyes had taken on a steely glint that made one of the younger bikers step back unconsciously. I faced worse than playground bullies with loud motorcycles, Harold said. Much worse, and I'm still here. Something in his voice made Spike hesitate. The biker leader had intimidated many people, but something about this old veteran was different. There was no fear in those aged blue eyes, only a calculating patience that was somehow more unsettling than anger. Let's go, boys, Spike finally said, trying to save face. We don't want to hurt some old-timer and end up in the news. But watch yourself, Gramps. This isn't over. As the bikers returned to the diner, Harold straightened his cap one more time. He walked calmly to the entrance, nodding reassuringly to the worried faces watching through the window. Inside, Sally hurried to his usual booth, her hands shaking as she poured his coffee. Are you okay, Harold? She whispered. I was so worried. I was about to call the police. Harold smiled gently. I'm fine, Sally, but you're right. Something needs to be done. He reached for the diner's phone book under the counter. And I know exactly who to call. The bikers watched from their booth as Harold began writing down numbers from the phone book. They laughed and made jokes, but their laughter seemed forced now. They had expected to intimidate an old man, but instead, they had awakened something they didn't quite understand yet. That afternoon, Harold sat at his kitchen table with 3 items in front of him, his old black address book, the diner's phone book, and a cup of strong coffee. The address book's leather cover was worn smooth from years of use, its pages yellow with age. He hadn't opened it in years, but he had never thrown it away. Today, he was glad he kept it. The final incident at the diner that morning had pushed things too far. After his confrontation with Spike, Harold had watched helplessly as the bikers deliberately knocked over an elderly woman's walker when she finally found a parking spot. The woman, Mrs. Peterson from his church, had fallen and scraped her hands on the rough pavement. That's enough, Harold muttered to himself, opening his address book. His fingers, though wrinkled with age, moved quickly through the pages. Each name he found brought back memories of faces, battles, and training sessions from his days as a Marine Corps instructor. He picked up his phone and dialed the first number. After 3 rings, a gruff voice answered. Mike Johnson speaking. Mike, it's Harold Thompson, from the Corp, 1952. There was a moment of silence, then excitement in Mike's voice. Sergeant Thompson, the hand-to-hand combat instructor. Sir, I haven't heard your voice in years. Harold smiled. Mike, I need a favor. Remember what you said about always having my back? Of course, sir. Whatever you need. Harold explained the situation at the diner. As he talked, he could hear Mike's anger growing. Those punks did what to Mrs. Peterson. Sir, give me 2 hours. I'll make some calls. The next number Harold dialed was to Robert Chen, now a veterans organization leader in the next town. Bobby, remember when I taught you that special wrist lock in 63? I need your help now. One by one, Harold called his old students and fellow veterans. Some were from World War II, others from Korea and Vietnam. Each call followed the same pattern: surprise, recognition, then immediate offer of help. Many of them had trained under Harold, learning not just fighting techniques, but lessons about honor and standing up for others. As the afternoon sun began to set, Harold's coffee had gone cold, but his list of confirmed supporters had grown long. He had even reached James Martinez, now a respected police officer who had promised to be coincidentally patrolling near the diner the next morning. The last call was to Bill Davidson, who ran the local Veterans Motorcycle Club. "Those crown skulls are giving all bikers a bad name," Bill growled over the phone. "Don't worry, Sarge. My boys will be there. We ride with respect." Harold put down the phone and looked at his notes. Tomorrow morning, the Crown Skulls would learn an important lesson about community and respect. But first, he had one more thing to do. Walking to his bedroom closet, Harold reached up to the top shelf and took down a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, was his old Marine Corps instructor badge and a set of worn photographs. The photos showed a younger Harold teaching combat techniques to groups of Marines. He picked up one particular photo, himself demonstrating a takedown move on a man twice his size. Even then, he had taught that size wasn't everything. Technique, discipline, and courage mattered more. Harold placed the badge in his pocket alongside his instructor pin. Tomorrow, he wouldn't need his walking cane. It had only been for show anyway, something to make others underestimate him. At 93, he moved slower than he used to, but his mind was sharp and his hands remembered every technique. Looking in the mirror, Harold straightened his veteran's cap. "Time to teach one last lesson," he said to his reflection. The old warrior in the mirror looked back with determined eyes. That night, Harold slept peacefully. In his dreams, he was back on the training grounds, teaching young Marines about honor and courage. Tomorrow, those lessons would come full circle, but not in the way the Crown Skulls would expect. As he drifted off to sleep, Harold smiled, knowing that sometimes the best way to fight wasn't with fists, but with friendship, community, and the bonds forged in service to others. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Harold arrived at Joe's Diner at 7:15 a.m., 15 minutes earlier than usual. He walked straight and tall, without his cane, wearing his veteran's cap with its collection of pins gleaming in the morning sun. His Marine Corps instructor badge was polished and pinned prominently on his chest. The Crown Skulls were already there, their motorcycles spread across the parking lot as usual. Spike noticed Harold approaching and nudged his friends, grinning. "Look who's back for more trouble," he called out, and he forgot his walking stick. The bikers formed their usual intimidating circle around Harold, but before Spike could speak again, a low rumbling sound filled the air. It started as a distant thunder, but grew quickly louder. Around the corner came the first wave. 20 motorcycles, their riders wearing leather vests covered in military patches. Bill Davidson led them, his Vietnam veteran patch clearly visible. They parked in a perfect formation, leaving the middle of the parking lot clear. Spike's confident smile faltered. What's this supposed to be? But more engines were approaching. From another direction came a convoy of trucks and cars, each with veteran plates and military stickers. They parked alongside the motorcycles, and out stepped men and women of all ages, veterans from World War II to recent conflicts. Mike Johnson, now in his 80s but still standing straight, walked up first. "Morning, Sergeant Thompson," he said, saluting Harold formally. "Reporting as requested, sir." More veterans approached, each greeting Harold with deep respect. Some were old, some young, some walked with canes or prosthetic limbs, but all carried themselves with dignity. They formed a loose circle around Harold and the Crown Skulls, who now looked significantly less confident. Robert Chen arrived with a group of younger veterans. "Ready for duty, Sergeant," he said. "Just like you taught us, stand up for what's right." James Martinez, in his police uniform, pulled up in his patrol car. He stepped out, adjusted his badge, and walked over casually. "Everything okay here, folks? Just doing my regular morning patrol." The Crown Skulls found themselves surrounded by over 50 veterans, representing every branch of the military and several generations of service. Bill Davidson's motorcycle club members stood with their arms crossed, their own leather vests showing legitimate military honors rather than made-up patches. What's going on here? Spike demanded, trying to sound tough despite his obvious nervousness. Harold stepped forward, his voice clear and strong. You wanted to know who I am, he said. Well, these men and women can tell you. For 20 years, I trained Marine Corps hand-to-hand combat instructors. Every person here either trained under me or served with someone who did. Mike Johnson spoke up. Sergeant Thompson taught us more than just fighting. He taught us about honor, respect, and protecting those who need help. And now, Bill Davidson added, we're going to teach you the same lesson. Inside the diner, customers and staff watched through the windows. Sally was filming everything on her phone, while Joe stood proudly at the door. Mrs. Peterson was there too, her scraped hands bandaged but her eyes bright as she watched. Spike looked around at the wall of veterans surrounding his small group. His tough guy facade crumbled as he realized how badly he had misjudged the situation. This wasn't just about one old man anymore. This was about a community standing together. Maybe we should talk about this, Spike said, his voice noticeably softer. Harold nodded. Yes, we should. But first, those traffic cones need to go, and your motorcycles need to be parked properly. This is a place of respect now. The Crown Skulls looked at their leader, waiting for his response. Behind them, the veterans stood silently, their message clear without words. The moment of truth had arrived, and everyone waited to see what Spike would choose. Continued conflict or a chance to learn about real respect and honor. The tension in the parking lot could have been cut with a knife. Spike stood there, looking less like a fearsome biker leader and more like a confused young man. His eyes moved from Harold to the gathered veterans, then back to Harold again. Finally, Spike spoke, his voice different from before, quieter, almost respectful. You said you were a Marine Corps instructor? What years did you teach? 1952 to 1972, Harold replied clearly. Trained over 1,000 Marines in hand-to-hand combat at Camp Pendleton. Something changed in Spike's face. The color drained from it as he reached for his wallet with trembling hands. He pulled out an old, folded photograph and stared at it for a moment before speaking. My grandfather, Spike said, his voice shaking slightly. He was a Marine. He had this picture in his room until the day he died. I kept it after. He held out the photograph to Harold. Harold took the worn photo carefully. In it, a young Marine was practicing a defensive stance, and behind him stood a younger version of Harold, demonstrating the proper technique. Harold remembered that day. It was a hot summer afternoon in 1963. Thomas Richards, Harold said softly, remembering the name. One of my best students. Quick learner, great spirit. Always helped the newer recruits. Spike's tough guy mask crumbled completely. That was my grandfather. He told me stories about his instructor, the one who taught him to be a real man. He said this instructor saved his life in more ways than one. Spike's voice cracked. He said his instructor was named Harold Thompson. The other Crown Skulls watched in amazement as their leader wiped his eyes quickly. The veterans around them maintained a respectful silence, understanding the weight of the moment. Your grandfather was a fine Marine, Harold said. He wrote to me a few times after his service. Told me he had a grandson he was proud of. That must have been you. Spike nodded, struggling to speak. He raised me after my parents died. Always told me about honor and respect, just like you taught him. But after he passed away last year, I guess I forgot those lessons. The other Crown Skulls shifted uncomfortably, looking at their boots. One of them removed his sunglasses, showing young eyes that now held shame instead of arrogance. Tom always said that true strength isn't about intimidation, Harold continued, handing the photo back carefully. It's about protecting others, showing respect, and standing up for what's right. Spike took a deep breath and straightened his shoulders. Then, to everyone's surprise, he snapped to attention and gave Harold a perfect military salute, something his grandfather had obviously taught him. Sergeant Thompson, Spike said formally, I apologize for my behavior and that of my friends. We've dishonored everything my grandfather stood for. We dishonored everything you taught him. Harold returned the salute. At ease, son. Your grandfather would be proud to see you remembering his lessons, even if you took a detour along the way. Spike turned to his fellow Crown Skulls. Move the bikes, park them properly, and those traffic cones go in the trash. The bikers hurried to comply, now showing the same respect their leader had found. The gathered veterans watched with approval as the Crown Skulls reorganized their motorcycles to take up only the space they needed. Inside the diner, Sally was crying happy tears. Joe started brewing fresh coffee, knowing his diner was about to be fuller than it had been in weeks. Mrs. Peterson smiled, understanding that sometimes the greatest victories come not through force, but through unexpected connections. Harold looked at the gathered crowd, veterans old and young, reformed bikers, and community members. In that moment, he saw what he had always taught, that the true measure of strength lies not in the ability to intimidate, but in the power to transform conflict into understanding. Your grandfather also made the best coffee in the barracks, Harold said to Spike. Let's go inside. I'll tell you some stories about him that you might not have heard. Joe's diner had never been so crowded. Every booth and counter seat was filled with an unusual mix of people, veterans of different ages, reformed bikers, and regular customers. The smell of coffee and breakfast filled the air, along with the sound of friendly conversation and occasional laughter. Spike sat in Harold's usual booth, but this time he sat respectfully across from the veteran instead of lounging arrogantly. On the table between them lay the old photograph of Spike's grandfather, along with Harold's collection of military pins that he used to explain different stories. Your grandfather saved 3 men that day, Harold was saying, pointing to one particular pin. The enemy had them cornered, but Tom's hand-to-hand combat training made the difference. He never bragged about it, did he? Spike shook his head, his eyes fixed on the photo. No, sir, he hardly ever talked about the fighting. You mostly told me about the lessons you taught about honor and looking out for others. At nearby tables, the other Crown Skulls sat with various veterans, listening to stories and asking questions. Their leather jackets still marked them as bikers, but their attitudes had completely changed. One young biker was helping an elderly veteran cut his pancakes, while another offered his arm to Mrs. Peterson as she walked to her seat. Sally moved between the tables with a fresh pot of coffee, smiling at the transformation. She no longer trembled when approaching the bikers' tables. Instead, she was teaching them the regulars' names and favorite orders. You know, Spike said, looking around the diner, my grandfather always said his best memories were about brotherhood and helping others. I thought being tough meant making people fear us, but I was wrong. Harold nodded. Fear is easy, son. Respect is harder to earn, but it lasts longer. Just then, Bill Davidson from the Veterans Motorcycle Club approached their booth. Spike, I've been talking with my boys. We got a proposal for you and your crew. Spike sat up straighter. Sir. We run a motorcycle escort service for military funerals, Bill explained. We also help with veteran events and community service. Your group seems to have some skilled riders. Would you be interested in joining us? The change in Spike's face was remarkable. The last traces of his tough guy mask disappeared, replaced by genuine emotion. You trust us with that? Trust is earned, Bill said. But everyone deserves a chance to earn it. What do you say? Spike looked at Harold, who nodded encouragingly. We be honored, sir, Spike replied. My grandfather would have loved that. Joe appeared from the kitchen, carrying a special plate. I found my wife's old recipe book, he announced. This apple pie was my bestseller years ago, before things got so busy. Thought today was a good day to bring it back. As Joe served the pie, Harold noticed more changes around the diner. The Crown Skulls had taken down their intimidating gang stickers from the windows. Instead, one of them was helping Joe put up a new sign that read Veterans Welcome, Military Discount Available. Mrs. Peterson was showing some of the younger bikers photos of her own military service as a nurse in Korea. The bikers listened respectfully, asking thoughtful questions and offering to help maintain her garden. Outside, the parking lot had been transformed. The motorcycles were now neatly parked, leaving plenty of space for other customers. The Crown Skulls had even helped repaint some of the parking lines that had faded over time. Sergeant Thompson, Spike said suddenly, would you consider? I mean, if you're willing, would you teach me some of what you taught my grandfather? Not the fighting, but the other stuff about honor and leadership. Harold smiled, reminded of another young man who had asked him the same question many years ago. I'd be proud too, son. But first, you need to understand something your grandfather knew well. The strongest people are the ones who lift others up, not push them down. Spike nodded, understanding filling his eyes. Around them, the diner buzzed with the sound of new friendships forming and old barriers breaking down. What had started as a story of conflict had become something else entirely, a story of redemption, respect, and the power of unexpected connections to change lives. 3 months had passed since the confrontation in Joe's diner parking lot, and the changes were remarkable. The small strip mall had transformed from a place people avoided into a thriving community center. On this sunny morning, Harold arrived for breakfast to find the parking lot already busy, but not with intimidating bikers. Instead, he saw the Crown Skull's motorcycles lined up neatly, each one now sporting a new patch that read Veterans Honor Guard alongside their old Skull logo. Spike stood at the diner's door, holding it open for an elderly couple. He wore his leather jacket, but it now had additional patches showing his grandfather's Marine Corps unit and a volunteer service badge. When he saw Harold approaching, he smiled and snapped to attention. "Morning, Sergeant Thompson. Your usual booth is ready," Spike said, giving Harold a respectful nod. Inside, the diner had come alive with new energy. The walls now displayed photographs of local veterans, including a prominent one of Harold teaching Spike's grandfather. Below it hung a framed picture from last week's veterans ceremony, showing the Crown Skulls providing a motorcycle escort for a military funeral. Sally bustled between tables with a new confidence. "Harold, you won't believe what these boys did yesterday," she said, pouring his coffee. "They helped Mrs. Chen repaint her entire flower shop. Even built her a new display stand for her plants." The other Crown Skulls members were scattered throughout the diner, but not as intimidating presences. One was teaching a young veteran how to maintain his motorcycle, while another helped Joe fix the wobbly ceiling fan that had bothered customers for years. "The best part," Joe said, bringing Harold his breakfast, "is that business has doubled. Turns out, when you combine good food with respect and community spirit, people notice." Harold watched as Mrs. Peterson entered the diner, now using a new walker that the bikers had specially modified for her. It had been painted with Marine Corps colors and fitted with special holders for her shopping bags. "Sergeant," she said, patting Harold's shoulder as she passed, "my garden has never looked better. These young men have such strong backs and willing hearts." Bill Davidson from the Veterans Motorcycle Club sat down across from Harold. "You know what Spike did last week?" he asked. "He started a mentoring program. Pairs up troubled young riders with veterans. Already got 15 kids signed up." The diner's bell chimed as more customers entered, a mix of veterans, locals, and even some former rival bike gang members who had heard about the changes and wanted to learn. The Crown Skulls, once feared, were now respected community leaders. "Your grandfather would be proud," Harold said to Spike when the young man brought him a fresh cup of coffee. "You've turned his lessons into something special." Spike's eyes grew misty. "I found more of his letters," he said. "The ones he wrote to you after his service. Reading them helped me understand what real strength means." He paused. "We're organizing a veterans support ride next month. Would you lead it with me?" Harold smiled. "I might be a bit old for motorcycles, son." "Already thought of that," Spike grinned. "We've got a sidecar set up. All the comfort of a chair with all the honor of leading the pack." Through the window, Harold could see Mrs. Chen arranging flowers outside her shop. Her business was booming now that customers felt safe visiting the strip mall. The Crown Skulls had even set up a monthly bike wash fundraiser in her parking lot to help local veteran causes. "You know what the best part is?" Joe said, refilling coffee cups. "Every morning, I watch young people stopping to talk with our veteran customers, learning from their stories. Real respect, real community." Harold looked around at his transformed world. The diner full of friendship instead of fear, the parking lot organized instead of chaotic, and most importantly, the hearts that had changed from seeking power to finding purpose. "Sometimes," Harold said softly, "the greatest victories aren't won with fists or force, but with patience, understanding, and the courage to change." Spike nodded, understanding filling his eyes. "That's what my grandfather tried to tell me. I finally get it now." He straightened his jacket, now proudly displaying both his old Crown Skulls patch and his new veteran support badges. Sometimes the toughest thing to do is the right thing. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, highlighting not just a business saved, but a community reborn through the unlikeliest of friendships.